The narrow room in the Parisian palace is damp, even though the heating is on constantly. The stone walls radiate cold. The corridor smells of wet wool from raincoats. Wax drips heavily from the candles onto the table, where there are no romantic props, but boring objects of power. Rolled up charters, a letter from the Curia with a neatly written date, a list of Aquitaine's vassals with notes in the margins. On the top sheet, there are no words about feelings, but a dry formula about incompatibility and forbidden kinship. Adults in heavy robes walk around, exchanging glances, and everyone understands. Behind this supposedly cold marriage story lies the hottest dispute of the century: who will own the southern lands, vineyards, cities, and roads through which wealth flows. Hello, viewers. I am glad to see you here. Write in the comments where you are watching this story from, and which stories about kings and queens seem to you the most cruel or the most honest. I wish you a peaceful and attentive listening experience. Let's move on to the story. To understand why the marriage of Louis VII and Eleanor of Aquitaine became one of the most expensive annulments in history, you need to put aside the romantic image of unrequited love and look at the map. In the second half of the 12th century, the French crown was not a monolithic kingdom, but a patchwork quilt. The king's direct possessions around Paris looked like a pitiful island, surrounded by seas controlled by dukes and counts. In the north were Normandy and Flanders, living by their own rules. In the southwest was Aquitaine, a huge expanse of land from the Loire to the Pyrenees, with rich cities, ports, wine, salt, and expensive fabrics. Whoever controlled Aquitaine held half of Western Europe's trade routes in their grip. Eleanor is not just a rebellious woman from legend. She is the rightful heir to this vast complex, the daughter of a duke, who in her youth was accustomed to seeing merchants, minstrels, and emissaries pass through her cities. When her father died in 1137, she became Duchess of Aquitaine, and this status alone made her a target. Either her marriage would make the King of France the ruler of almost half the country, or it would give the south to another house. In a legal sense, her body was just a shell for land rights. At the same time, the heir to the French throne, the future Louis VII, was preparing not for power, but for the monastery. He was raised as a man of prayer, not as a ruthless feudal predator. When his older brother dies, the plan changes, and the introverted young man, prone to religious extremes, unexpectedly finds himself the future king. The death of Louis VI brought two lines of destiny together in one knot. The Duchess of Aquitaine was hastily betrothed to the new king so that the Colossus of the South would be under the northern crown. In romantic retellings, all this is turned into a story of a characterological catastrophe. The quiet, almost monk-like king could not withstand the free thinking and power of his Aquitaine wife, while she suffocated in a cold marriage. But 12th century documents know nothing of temperaments. They speak the language of lands, revenues, and vassal loyalty. In the royal charters of those years, next to the names of Louis and Eleanor, there is almost always a formula stating which lands are confirmed as belonging to the crown and what privileges are granted to monasteries, cities, and vassals. Each such sheet is a brick in a structure where marriage is not about feelings, but a way to cement control over the South. The shadow of private life appears in the sources indirectly, through facts that were more frightening than any scandal for that era. Over the years of their marriage, the couple had only daughters. For the 12th century, this was not just a family disappointment, but a political concern. Royal power was not yet strong enough to calmly transfer the throne to a woman. The absence of an adult male heir frightened the barons, who remembered the recent wars for the throne all too well. Against the backdrop of this fear, any talk of incompatibility became a convenient smokescreen. Rumors about the rebellious queen began to take on a life of their own in chronicles and later retellings. She was accused of too free manners at court, of playing too independent a role in the administration of Aquitaine, and of suspicious sympathies for her relatives in the East during the Second Crusade. But if we look not at the texts of moralists, but at real documents, acts, charters, letters from the Curia, a different picture emerges. Eleanor regularly appears as a confirming party in transactions involving Aquitaine land, as a guarantor of privileges for monasteries and cities in the south. She is not just a decoration on the throne, but a channel through which Paris influences a region prone to independence. Louis himself seemed strange for a king in the eyes of his contemporaries. Very religious, prone to emotional decisions, capable of simultaneously giving orders for brutal punitive operations and then repenting for them for years. One of the darkest episodes of his life was the burning of the church in Vitry, where hundreds of people locked inside died during the assault. For a ruler who had been raised as a future cleric, this became a personal trauma. He went on a crusade not only as a state measure, but also as an attempt to atone for his own participation in the mass deaths. The chronicles emphasize his grief and guilt, but in business correspondence, these moods turn into a different reality. The king, absorbed by the idea of saving his soul, has a poor grasp on the complex network of southern vassals. The Aquitaine lords, grown men accustomed to independence, quickly realize that the northern king is weaker than he seems. He is harder to hate than to despise. In their eyes, he is a man torn between spiritual ideals and the dirty practice of governance. Aquitaine, on the other hand, lives by pragmatism, trade, duties, local wars, alliances with neighboring counts and dukes. They do not need an abstract, pious king, but a strong patron who can be tough when it is profitable. This contrast increases the tension between Paris and the South, and it is this, not cooled feelings, that makes the marriage fragile. Another documentary plot develops in parallel: correspondence with the Roman Curia. Already in the middle of the marriage, there are talks about the possibility of annulment on the basis of blood relationship. Formally, the spouses are indeed related within the forbidden degrees. A common ancestor, Robert II, connects their genealogies. But this relationship was known at the time of the marriage, and it is doubly remarkable that the papal authority first turns a blind eye to this fact and then refuses for a long time to recognize it as grounds for divorce. This is a direct blow to the popular myth that the Church was just waiting for an excuse to punish the rebellious queen or free the religious king. When the king and queen appealed to the Pope for an annulment, his initial reaction was negative. The documents of the Roman Chancellery describe the case dryly. The marriage between Louis and Eleanor remains valid. Married life must continue, and attempts at annulment are not approved. The Pope, concerned about the unity of the Christian world against the backdrop of the failures of the Crusades, is not interested in seeing the largest kingdom in the West plunged into a new crisis. In his eyes, annulment was not just a private matter, but a possible precedent that would be followed by dozens of other attempts to use kinship as a political weapon. But with each passing year, the pressure intensified. The absence of an adult male heir became a threat to the entire Capetian dynasty. French barons, especially those who held large fiefdoms, saw this as an opportunity. If the king dies without a son, they will be able to bargain for new privileges in exchange for supporting one branch or another. And every year without an heir makes the price of this bargain higher. In such a situation, marriage to the rich but difficult to manage Aquitaine begins to seem less like a blessing to Paris than a time bomb. This is where the first serious twist in the myth versus paper story appears. The popular image says that Louis was tired of his too bright wife, couldn't stand the rumors and her character, and therefore decided to part ways, hiding behind a theological formula. The archives show the opposite. It was precisely those most interested in strengthening royal power who feared annulment. The dissolution of the marriage meant that Eleanor would regain Aquitaine as an independent ruler and be able to marry anyone she wanted, whether the heir to the Anglo-Norman house or an ambitious neighbor. Then, Paris would risk getting not a semi-dependent province in the south, but a powerful bloc hostile to royal power. That is why we see caution in the sources until the very last moment. Influential clerics at court, such as Abbot Suger, act as a brake. They understand better than anyone else that losing control of Aquitaine is not a romantic gesture, but strategic suicide. As long as such people are alive and influential, the idea of annulment stalls. But human biology does not only apply to the question of heirs. Not only queens grow old and die, but also advisors. The death of those who oppose the breakup paves the way for a new party. Those who are willing to take risks, hoping to play big and win the future of the dynasty at the cost of losing half the country. This gamble seems crazy only on paper. In the logic of the 12th century, it is almost rational. If the marriage is preserved and no son is born, after Louis's death, there may be a struggle for power between different branches of the family, which, through Eleanor and her daughters, will claim rights to Aquitaine and the throne itself. If the marriage were dissolved now, there would be a chance to marry another princess and have a long-awaited male heir, even at the cost of Eleanor taking the south with her. The calculation is as cold as the stone of the cathedral. Better a controllable, albeit smaller, domain with a legitimate heir than a huge but fragile structure ready to collapse at the first shock. Against this backdrop, the couple's personal relationship recedes into the background, although the chronicles throw in details that are convenient for future legends. Yes, the king and queen are gradually drifting apart. Yes, their travels, joint participation in the Second Crusade, failed diplomatic initiatives, and constant pressure from the court are turning their marriage into a heavy, almost lifeless shell. But law and politics do not know the words, "Love has broken down." They know only the presence or absence of an heir, the degree of blood relationship, and the strategic value of the southern lands. While rumors of the rebellious queen circulate in refectories and scriptoria, another, quieter stream of text flows toward Rome. It contains fewer emotional details and more references to canon law. There, they measure degrees of kinship rather than temperaments, count generations back to a common ancestor, and discuss formulas for annulment so as not to cast a shadow on the legitimacy of the daughters born. Where people love to talk about hot Eleanor, the documents show the cold work of adult men in cassocks who are looking for ways to legally translate a political problem into theological terms. This work is tragic in its own way. Every step toward annulment undermines confidence in marriage as an instrument of geopolitics. If a royal union can be declared null and void after 15 years on the pretext of kinship that was known from the outset, what is to prevent other great lords from attempting to do the same? With every letter, every meeting in the Curia, every internal act of the royal chancellery, the system of loyalty, built on marital alliances, receives a small crack. But those who write these texts see before them a more frightening specter, the possibility of a dynastic crisis that will plunge France into a series of wars, as England had been a generation earlier. While officials and clerics argue over wording, the map of Europe trembles imperceptibly. The Aquitaine vassals, the Anglo-Norman rulers, and neighboring houses are closely watching what is happening in the marriage of Louis and Eleanor, because they understand that the outcome of this cold union will determine who will control not only southern France, but also the balance of power across the English Channel. And when people in the corridors of Paris whisper about incompatible personalities, those with maps on their tables see not personalities, but possible lines of future division. It is at this moment that it becomes clear how far the gap between myth and document has grown. Above the text, where everything is reduced to characters and cooling of feelings, another line emerges in the archives. An adult couple, whose union was originally based on control over a vast territory, gradually becomes a problem for those responsible for the stability of the kingdom. The closer we get to the middle of the 12th century, the stronger this pressure is felt in the sources. A new generation of players enters the scene. In the West, a figure is gaining strength who will soon become a nightmare for the French crown: Henry Plantagenet, the son of the Count of Anjou, heir to Normandy, and pretender to the English throne. He is gathering pieces of power under his control that are too similar in scale to what is so feared around Paris. For him, Eleanor is not just a woman with a legendary reputation, but the key to uniting Normandy, Anjou, future England, and Aquitaine into a single bloc. For Paris, she is still the queen, formally bound by marriage to Louis, and the thought that this living bond could be broken and fall into foreign hands makes every conversation about annulment almost panic-stricken. Despite this, the internal reckoning continues. Years of marriage have not produced any sons. The French barons are growing up, each with their own heirs and their own plans. Within the royal family, fatigue is building up from an alliance that seems to hold them back more than it offers prospects. The situation is also difficult for Eleanor. Her own power in Aquitaine is partially dissolved in the royal domain, and she has to constantly balance the interests of the southern vassals with the demands of the northern court. In this position, she is more like an overburdened mediator than the indomitable queen of anecdotes. The official steps towards annulment take the form of church procedures. The couple appeals to the church authorities, pointing to the degree of kinship, the absence of sons, and the formal grounds for declaring the marriage invalid. The Pope stalls for time, weighing the risks, but the pressure does not subside. In the end, the case is taken out of general deliberations and brought before a specific council. In the 11th year of the 52nd, with the participation of the bishops, a church assembly is convened, where the marriage union of Louis and Eleanor is declared invalid on the grounds of kinship. The wording is dry, almost lifeless. It is not that love has died, but that the union was entered into in violation of canonical norms. The most frightening thing is that this formula works like a knife on a map. With the annulment, Eleanor once again becomes the full-fledged Duchess of Aquitaine, an adult ruler with the right to freely dispose of her destiny. She does not lose her dignity. Her daughters are recognized as legitimate, but most importantly, she once again becomes the center around which a new combination is formed. Paris, freed from the cold marriage and given the opportunity to find a new wife for Louis, simultaneously loses control over the southern bloc. Almost immediately, it becomes clear what the most far-sighted advisors feared. Eleanor makes a decision that will forever go down in the history books. She forms an alliance with Henry Plantagenet. For the 12th century, this is not a romantic step, but a predatory logical one. Henry is young, energetic, steadfast in military affairs and diplomacy, and has a real chance of obtaining the English crown. Combined with his existing possessions, his marriage to the Duchess of Aquitaine creates a bloc that contemporaries would later call almost an empire, stretching from Scotland to the Pyrenees. For the French crown, this moment is a worst-case scenario come true. By annulling the marriage to save the dynasty and get a chance at a son from another wife, Louis effectively gave Aquitaine to his future rival. From a geopolitical point of view, it looks like a voluntary surrender of control over half the country. In chronicles and later writings, this step is shrouded in moral commentary, turning it into an almost moral parable about how excessive piety or inability to understand one's wife can cost kings dearly. But the documents know nothing of punishment for character. They show a chain of decisions where each step seems justified at the moment of adoption and catastrophic in retrospect. Retribution comes quickly. Henry strengthens his position and becomes King of England, and with him, Aquitaine also joins the Anglo-Norman bloc. The French crown gains a new, incredibly powerful neighbor whose possessions squeeze it from the north, west, and south. Everything that Suger's advisors had feared so much came to pass in a new configuration. Now, it was not Louis who controlled the south through marriage, but Henry, through Eleanor, who was able to put pressure on France from almost three sides. On the periphery of the sources, this is reflected in a change in the tone of the acts. There is an increasing need to confirm the loyalty of vassals and to ensure that local lords do not look with envy at the new powerful bloc. At the level of human destinies, this looks like a cold tragedy. An adult king who sincerely believes in the need for a proper marriage and heir pays for his gamble by giving his rival what he once considered his main gain. An adult duchess who had existed for many years within the framework of a cold union emerges from it not as a victim, but as a person capable of redistributing world powers. In modern language, this would be called a geopolitical realignment. In the language of the 12th century, it was simply a new reality. Thus, the myth of love that broke crumbles when a map and a collection of letters are placed next to it. No stories about the rebellious queen explain why the main theme in the documents is land, vassals, rights to cities, and crossings. The annulment of Louis and Eleanor's marriage is not a story about how two adults did not get along. It is a story about how an attempt to solve a dynastic problem through a theological formula opened the door to the creation of a powerful bloc that would determine the wars between France and England for centuries to come. And it is in this new reality that the quietest but most devastating consequences of the annulment begin to manifest themselves, consequences that are rarely mentioned in popular retellings. Nervousness spreads around Paris. Barons who felt confident yesterday now see the looming mass of Anglo-Norman lands. Despair is growing within the royal council. Everyone understands that a mistake has been made, but no one can name it directly. The king cannot be blamed. The church cannot be blamed. The procedure cannot be blamed. Everything was done by the book. And yet, the result turns France into a weakened core surrounded by a powerful ring. This vulnerability is reflected in documents in the most mundane way: an increase in the number of fortifications, amendments to tax collection, and the appointment of new officials in the borderlands. All this looks like routine economic activity, but in fact speaks of fear. The French crown has just lost control of a huge part of the south, and now it has to build defenses with the resources it has left. The king, who dreamed of a son and heir, is now forced to think about how to protect his lands from his ex-wife's husband. Meanwhile, Eleanor, now an adult and experienced ruler, finds herself at the center of a new power structure. Most importantly, her position is completely different. She has real influence in Anjou and Normandy. Her alliance strengthens Henry's young reign in England, and the Aquitaine nobility still sees her as their own ruler. In the south, she is treated not as the former Queen of France, but as a duchess whose decisions influence trade, judicial reforms, and the structure of cities. She has more real power in her hands than she did during the years of her cold marriage. Using this power, Henry gained enormous resources. He began to build a network of control. He appointed judges, punished rebellious barons, and strengthened the fleet. To his French contemporaries, this looked like a slow-motion disaster. Not war, but the preparations for it. Documents show how pressure on the Frankish borderlands intensified over several years. Castles in Normandy were fortified, a ship tax was collected, and an administrative system was formed that would become the basis for future claims on French territories. And all this was driven by the alliance with Eleanor. But there is another layer, the personal cost for those who remained in Paris. Louis understands that his decision was the beginning of a long and unpleasant series of defeats. Diplomatic letters often contain phrases hinting at the need to rectify the situation. This was expressed in the search for a new wife, in attempts to strengthen relations with other princes, and in a cautious policy towards the Vatican. The king, described by his contemporaries as gentle and God-fearing, was now forced to act out of fear rather than conviction. The gravity of what was happening is also evident in the rapid change in the tone of the chroniclers. Where moral judgments of Louis and Eleanor's union had previously prevailed, there now appeared cold regret about a strategic mistake. The Queen's character and the rumors surrounding her fade into the background, replaced by the question, how can France live with the fact that Aquitaine is gone forever? The chronicles avoid accusations, but their silence speaks louder than words. After the annulment, the kingdom seems to be rebuilding itself, and this recovery does not look confident. The situation is particularly tense in relations with the southern nobility. Many barons of Aquitaine, deprived of French control, now turn to Henry as a more reliable protector. Those who were still hesitant yesterday are now leaning towards him, because the South has always lived differently from the North. Trade, its own customs, 3 languages, local courts. The French crown seems too distant, too foreign to them. The power that Louis tried to retain through marriage is now crumbling without a fight. In a political sense, this means that France is entering a period when its main task is not to expand, but to hold on to what it has. Henry, who received Eleanor and her lands, begins to form the system that later historians will call the Angevin Empire, although his contemporaries avoided this word. For them, it was simply a huge block of power that destroyed the familiar balance. The Norman nobility grew stronger, the English barons gained new benefits, and the southern earls saw a chance to preserve their autonomy under the cover of a powerful alliance. The darkest part of this story is not that France lost part of its lands, nor that Eleanor went to her rival. The real darkness lies in how quickly and irrevocably a routine church procedure began to change the structure of Europe. One marriage alliance, concluded for convenience, and its dissolution, carried out according to canon law, trigger a long-lasting political conflict between 2 powers that will last more than 3 centuries. What appears in official documents as a formal annulment becomes the foundation for the future 100 Years' War. And in this contrast between the dry church formula and the geopolitical collapse, the main point becomes clear. The myth speaks of love that has dried up, or characters that did not match. The document speaks of land, vassals, strategies, dynasties. And if you look at the map, it becomes clear. The annulment of Louis and Eleanor's marriage is not a personal drama. It is the moment when one royal house relinquished its levers of control, and another gathered them in its hands and turned them into weapons. Geopolitics knows no romantic pauses. It knows only decisions and their price. In the silence of the archives, this turning point is particularly clear, because after it, the very nature of the sources changes. Where previously documents dominated, where the names of Louis and Eleanor stood side by side as 2 rulers, now parallel streams of text appear. In one, the King of France is trying to strengthen his reduced domain and finds a new wife. In the other, the Duchess of Aquitaine is already part of the vast Plantagenet estate, separate worlds, each with its own personal and political price. Louis, freed from marriage, soon remarries, first to a representative of the Castilian house, then to a woman from an influential Champagne lineage. These unions are not centered around land, but around tasks: to provide a long-awaited male heir, and at the same time retain the support of key groups of nobility. New women's names and new family ties appear in the letters, but through this layer, the main thing is clear. The king now has one obsessive goal: to give birth and build a more compact but stable core of power around his son. When the future Philip Augustus finally appears, the tension in the documents eases a little. Letters and acts record the celebration, but beneath it, one senses that the heir is being born into a different world, where a powerful Anglo-Norman bloc exists alongside him. At this time, another reality was forming around Eleanor. Her marriage to Henry produced sons who would eventually become figures of European stature. But more importantly, she continued to play a role in the administration of Aquitaine, participated in the confirmation of charters, and represented the interests of the South at her husband's court. The southern cities received double protection from this union. On the one hand, a strong patron in the person of the Anglo-Norman ruler, and on the other, a ruler who knew their traditions and language. There is no romance or anecdotes about hot temperament in these acts. There are taxes, privileges, judicial guarantees, and the rights of merchants and monasteries. This is where myth and document clash for the second time. Later, legend makes Eleanor almost a symbol of defiance, a figure who single-handedly decides the fate of kings. She is portrayed as an artist, the secret driving force behind political conspiracies, and the mistress of courts of love. But if you look at the actual charters, you see something else. She is constantly present as a confirming party in Aquitaine documents, signing agreements and ensuring the continuity of power. Her rebelliousness in the sources is expressed not in flashy gestures, but in stubborn administrative work, which is much more difficult to turn into a legend than a spectacular scandal. For Louis and his new generation, reality is also changing. The appearance of a legitimate heir gives the dynasty a chance for stability, but the strategic mistake of annulment does not disappear. Philip will rule under constant pressure from the Plantagenets. He will have to spend many years gradually reclaiming pieces of the very system that his father destroyed with a single decision. For him, Eleanor and her sons are not characters in a family drama, but opponents on a chessboard, and this is felt more strongly in his acts and chronicles than in any romanticized retelling. Meanwhile, church documents continue to exist as a parallel chronicle. In them, the marriage of Louis and Eleanor is designated as invalid. Everything is neatly written into the scheme of kinship, canon law, and observance of formulas. It is important for the clergy that the internal logic of the system remains intact. If the annulment is recognized, it means that justification has been found in the rules. The dry language of these documents is particularly disturbing given the consequences they trigger. For the papal chancellery, it is one line in a long list of matrimonial cases. For Europe, it is a turning point, after which the two royal houses will begin to move toward a series of wars. In practice, the aristocrats quickly learn their lesson. They see that marriages and annulments can be used not only as a tool of domestic policy, but also as a weapon of foreign policy. In the following decades, new attempts are made to justify dynastic moves with theological formulas. The more often this happens, the more the feeling that marriage is an indisputable sacred union is eroded. And this also hides part of the grim truth of the story of Louis and Eleanor. Their personal decision, formalized under the guise of canon law, became a model for the more cynical steps of other rulers. Southern France, meanwhile, lives in a state of double tension. On the one hand, its cities and seigneuries benefit from being part of a more powerful bloc. On the other hand, this makes them a constant target for the French crown. Any future king will see Aquitaine not just as a province, but as a symbol of lost control that must be regained. In local charters and court documents, this atmosphere is reflected in the fact that it is increasingly necessary to confirm old privileges, re-prescribe the rights of cities and monasteries, and calm the anxiety of merchants. Each new ruler seeks to assure that the order will not change, thereby only emphasizing how fragile it is. The myth of a cold marriage continues to exist alongside this documentary reality. It is convenient. It is easier to explain the annulment by saying that the king and queen were not suited to each other than to admit that the price of the mistake was a complete reshuffling of the political map. It is easier to talk about rumors than about long meetings with clergy, calculating degrees of kinship, and timid attempts to convince Rome. It is easier to talk about the rebellious queen than about the fact that in this story, an adult woman used the only legal means available to her to get out of a union that no longer gave her any influence or prospects. Thus, layer by layer, the chronicle squeezes the romance out of history. What remains are people forced to make decisions in circumstances where any step either strengthens the house or puts it at risk. Louis bets on annulment and a new dynasty, while Eleanor bets on an alliance with a more aggressive and active ruler. The papal curia bets on being able to maintain the canonical system by incorporating political reality into it. Each of them acts within the framework of their tasks, and the result is a world in which two royal houses are locked in conflict for centuries, growing out of one incompatible marriage. The disturbing thing about this story is that there is no villain who destroys order out of malice. There is a chain of pragmatic steps taken by adults who are convinced that they are saving the future. The documents do not shout, dramatize, or describe emotions. They simply record dates, names, and lands, and it is precisely in this coldness that we can truly hear how high the price of a cold marriage torn apart for the sake of heated politics turned out to be. After all these lines, there remains one last layer, the one where Louis's decision and Eleanor's step turn from events into a long-lasting shadow from which no ruler of subsequent generations can hide. In the fifth part, this shadow becomes almost tangible. It can be seen in the changing alliances, in the structure of European politics, in the way chroniclers describe new wars, as if their source always lay somewhere deeper than the latest burned city or broken treaty. And when you look at the documents without trying to bring them to life emotionally, it becomes clear that the annulment is not the end of the story, but the beginning of a long, exhausting struggle for the right to consider oneself the master of the South. Immediately after Aquitaine came under the control of the Plantagenets, France faced something it had never known before. Its neighbor was no longer a nominal vassal or local rival, but a house that possessed the English crown, Norman lands, Angevin administrative structures, and the vast cultural and economic South. Louis's territory seemed almost fragile compared to this massif surrounding Paris and Orleans. The official documents of the time reveal two contrasting emotions: anxiety and persistence. On the one hand, the king was forced to acknowledge the new reality. On the other hand, every document clearly expressed a desire to hold on to at least what remained. The first signs of a new policy appear in the letters of the next generation: strengthening the domain, gradually buying out or confiscating weak fiefs, supporting those barons who are willing to give up their southern claims for the sake of closeness to the king. But the silence of these acts is broken by the rumble of threat contained in the very existence of the Aquitaine-Anjou bloc. The chronicles emphasize the scale. The possessions of Henry and Eleanor stretch from Scotland to the Pyrenees. This is a territory that France cannot match in terms of the number of castles, economy, or road network. To the clergy, this sounds like a geographical description. To the barons, it sounds like a challenge. To the kings, it sounds like a necessity to seek a way out where there is none. Meanwhile, within the Aquitaine world itself, another movement begins: resistance. The southern cities, which valued their independence, are now forced to work within the huge Anglo-Norman structure. They try to preserve their rights, insist on old privileges, and demand confirmation of charters. The documents signed by Eleanor bear her seal and reflect her role as a link between her husband's court and Southern traditions. This is a rare case where a woman of high status retains political influence after a change of alliance. But the documents show that this influence is not merely decorative. It keeps Aquitaine from the upheavals that could make it an unpredictable prize for France. However, a generation later, tensions still erupted. Eleanor's sons, Henry the young king, Richard, and Geoffrey, entered into a series of conflicts, rebellions, and negotiations. And each time, their politics reflected not only ambition, but also the legacy of the marriage that had been broken in Paris. The southern lands became an arena of disputes between kings, heirs, and their vassals. Where Louis had tried to maintain control, people who considered themselves the rightful owners of the entire French map now ruled. Their ambitions grew along with the size of their possessions, and when the name of Philip Augustus first appeared in documents as an active ruler, it became clear that a new phase of struggle was inevitable. Philip acts not with the sword, but with strategy, almost mirroring his grandfather's steps while correcting his mistakes. He methodically destroys the Plantagenet system. He supports rebellious sons, forms alliances, takes land piece by piece, and takes advantage of every legal opportunity. His letters are characterized by cold precision. Every confiscation, every transfer of fief is formalized as if it were the natural result of a broken vassal oath. No one in the texts mentions that it all began with annulment, but the structure of the documents whispers about it. If the giant is destroyed, France will once again become the center of the map. While Philip builds his strategy, Eleanor spends her last decades in monasteries, castles, and negotiations. Her signature appears on deeds transferring land to monasteries, confirmations of charters, and guarantees of peace between her sons. She becomes a figure who holds together a disintegrating world with her energy and memory. Chronicles like to portray her as a symbol of the power of the South, but the documents tell a simpler story. She is a mature ruler who bears the consequences of decisions made decades ago by people trying to save their homes. A person who became a bridge between France and England, and at the same time, the reason why the bridge collapsed. The darkest outcome is only visible from the height of several generations. While the participants in the marriage are alive, Europe is cracking, but holding on. After their death, an era begins in which the conflict between the two crowns becomes a constant backdrop. The shadow of Aquitaine hangs over every treaty, every negotiation, every campaign. Later wars, from the Siege of Chinon to the 100 Years' War, stem from the mistake that the document recorded as an annulment on canonical grounds. Paper did what swords took centuries to achieve. Myth likes to explain everything simply. Love did not work out. The queen was rebellious. The marriage was cold. But the document, as usual, says less and is more frightening. It shows how one choice made by adult rulers turns the fates of millions of people into shifting borders, ruined cities, and endless campaigns. How a political decision under a religious pretext becomes the beginning of a chain that cannot be stopped. And when you look at this story as a whole, not as a family drama, but as an investigation, it becomes clear that the real fork in the road for Europe lay not between Louis and Eleanor as individuals, but between two models of power: the northern, cautious and slow, and the Aquitaine Anjou, abrupt and expanding. Their clash did not end in the 12th or 13th centuries. It continued to reverberate in documents, laws, and treaties, as if Europe had not yet decided who should be its center. The cold marriage died in the act of annulment. Hot politics lived on for centuries,